welcome back to another episode of the Catholic Buzz podcast. We're happy that you're joining us today for our part 2 on Vatican II. Last week we broke open a little bit about what the council was, what they wrote, what they talked, how they convened, and all those different things. Today we're going to talk about the fallout of Vatican II, and to do that, we have the Vatican II expert panel, Josh Sullivan over here, and Matt Van Milligan. Matt, I learned Latin for you. We call you dolor ad unum. Do you know what that means?
No, I don't.
The smart one.
Oh.
Yeah, I learned it this week.
Brains
Yeah.
and the beauty. Yeah. I mean, that's how we do it.
The ugly smart one. Got it. Yeah.
Do you actually know any Latin?
I took Latin.
Yeah.
I took a course in Latin. So it usually involves like looking at something in an old church, and it taking me like 10 minutes to piece it together, and 7 out of 10 times I actually get it right.
Yeah. It's still the official language of the church.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There are quite a few things to say about that.
Yeah.
And
That's a whole podcast in itself.
yeah.
Well, maybe we'll do an episode on the official language of the church. Latin. Okay, so last week we had a good discussion about Vatican II, and we just kind of talked about what it was for people who may not have been around when that happened, or it was good for people to sort of reflect on it because they lived through Vatican II. Imagine the excitement, though. I know the bishop of the Diocese of Sault Ste. Marie was in Rome at the time. So the excitement of knowing your bishop is part of this large meeting that's happening with the world's bishops, that was probably exciting for Catholics, and hearing back what's happening there and all these different things.
And it took place over a couple of years.
Yeah.
So it was like the hype was building too, right? I mean, like it wasn't just like a one meeting, okay, and then it's done. It was like a couple, like your bishop was gone for 3 or 4 months.
Yeah.
And going through these meetings and stuff, and then would come back and do what he needs to do in the diocese, and then go back again next year. And, it was a thing that just kind of kept building, and he would come back and probably talk about his experience. Mm-hmm. They said to me, I was reading one thing about the Vatican II, about how the very first session, they decided right off the bat, I think it was Pope John 23rd, decided right off the bat that nothing would be proclaimed or decided in the first session. It was just going to be discussed and get everybody's... get the spirit flowing, get things discussed and talked about, so everyone was kind of knew what was going on and but they weren't going to actually make any decisions off that first session. And he opened up with that in his address to the council.
You know what I was thinking about it? Like, imagine being part of a meeting like that, and you're given, because you said last week that people were given 5 minutes to speak.
Yeah.
Eh? Like each bishop was given 5 minutes to speak. You'd really have to pray about that. Eh?
Oh, yeah.
You have 5 minutes to speak to the world's bishops and the Holy Father sitting there. Especially look at our diocese in Northern Ontario, Canada. What would the Bishop of Ontario you'd really have to pray about what you would say if you had 5 minutes to address.
Wasn't there a bishop too? I think I can't remember who was telling me, but a bishop used his 5 minutes to talk specifically about St. Joseph.
Yeah, I was telling you because
it's
in the book, The Consecration to St. Joseph. So I believe he was a Polish bishop, and he had suffered greatly. I don't think anyone knew about his sufferings, but I believe he was locked up or imprisoned, and his devotion to St. Joseph, he says that St. Joseph really saved him. I don't know the whole story. It's in the book, The Consecration to St. Joseph. It's a beautiful story, but he used his 5 minutes to talk about St. Joseph and how we need to add St. Joseph to the Mass.
Yeah.
Today we do.
Yeah.
And because of his frail nature, and he was very nervous at public speaking. Yeah. He was maybe stuttering or maybe sweating like I do in public, and the bishops there unkindly thought, who's this guy talking about St. Joseph? And they kind of pushed him aside. But then in the book, The Consecration of St. Joseph, it said that Pope, I believe it was John the 23rd, called that bishop and said, thank you for what you said today. Yeah. And it happened.
I was added to one of the Eucharistic
the first one.
prayers. Yeah. But then progressively it's been added to the others as well.
Pope Francis added them to all the Eucharistic prayers,
Yeah.
yes, but it started at Vatican II with this, I believe, Polish bishop. Yeah,
Which is
I
awesome.
remember that.
Yeah.
With that 5 minutes, hey.
It did change the world.
If we had 5 minutes, gosh,
I don't know what we could get through.
we couldn't limit ourselves to 5 minutes. I don't think. Okay, we are talking about fallout. So obviously there are objections to Vatican II. We can't deny that some people have objections to what happened at Vatican II. There is a certain legacy that Vatican II has left behind, and then while people object to the changes from Vatican II, there are people who think there weren't enough changes as well. So there's sort
Both
of
sides.
opinion on all sort of the spectrum, and mostly surrounding the life of the church around liturgy.
Mm-hmm.
Eh?
Yeah.
I mean, also around, there was the question raised around, I think when the permanent diaconate was a product of Vatican II, or resurgence, and there was a question about female deacons as well, right? Yeah. And I think that is sort of a sore spot for some people as well. That conversation sort of happened again in the last couple of years. There was no definitive decision made there,
No.
So,
well, I mean, there was decisions made not on the diaconate, but because the diaconate, as you said before, diaconate at one time was transitional. You became a deacon and then you became a priest. And so the idea that you have permanent diaconate, well, if you have permanent diaconate that does never become a priest necessarily, can women then become deacons? And that is one question that has not been, even today, we're very definitive that women can't become priests. That will never happen. It's doctrinal and whatnot. And all three popes my last three popes that I've been alive for have all said so. But the position of diaconess, I don't know how you would say it, but women deacons, the book hasn't been closed on it. But there was a commission brought forward a number of years ago by Pope Francis. Yeah.
I'm saying a number of years ago. It may have been. I mean, 2020 is kind of a blur with COVID, right? So it may have been just a year and a half ago. I don't know. Or it may have been 3 years ago, I'm not sure. So there was people sort of exploring the scriptures and church teaching and the history and traditions of the church, and both sides decided that there was not enough sort of information to move forward
with this. Yeah.
Yes. So I guess you could say the book hasn't been closed on it, like you said.
Yeah. But it's decided we can't do anything with it.
Right at this time. Yeah. So that's one thing. Remember, ministries. We talked about this in one episode of the Catholic Buzz. Because priests, on your way to the priesthood, you would get you would be tonsured.
Yeah.
Exorcist, subdeacon.
Yeah.
Those were minor orders. Those were all eliminated and put ministries instead. So lector and acolyte, transitional deacon, ordination to the diaconate, and then priesthood. So those are some of the life of the church. That some changes have happened that you see. But let's talk the liturgy, because I know people are expecting us to talk about the liturgy, and Josh just can't wait. I can't wait.
Well, no, I just want to say, let's just look at the overall effects of it first, which is you had roughly 2,400 or 20, however many bishops that were there voting on, right? 2,400, something like that. The biggest split on these 16 documents, they would always vote, and then they would change some things, especially if it was a big split. But the biggest split in all of those documents was 2,300 votes, roughly, somewhere around there, to 70. That was the biggest split in any of them. And most of the documents, I think it's 12 out of 12 were less than 5 split. So it was, everybody and 5 people disagreed. And all of the bishops put their signature to it when they agreed. They all write in it. And so you have to think there is these men that are shepherds and pastors of their diocese, as well as the church and stuff. The Holy Spirit working through them creates these documents. And the Holy Spirit really did move, and you can see it in the wording of the documents, especially because we know, and there's history about this, and there's actual history, that there were people thinking, I think you mentioned it last week, now is the time we can change the church for what we think the church should be. You know what I mean? And so there were groups about it that were meeting at night and meeting like, and where, I mean, it depends on how much you get into the conspiracy of it, but there were people that had agendas, but those agendas didn't come forward in Vatican II. And you can see like what they talked about, they wanted to happen, and what actually happened, those didn't. And even some of the biggest splits that we have off of it from Vatican II, like Archbishop Pope Pius. Pius Society. Yeah. He signed the documents. He was in agreement with the wording of the documents at the time. He assigned all the documents in agreement. It was only after that he didn't like the practice that was put into, but he agreed with the wording. You know what I mean? So.
Yeah, okay, so let's look. So prior to the changes that came as a result of Vatican II, I'm watching my wording there, right? The Mass, the Holy Mass, was celebrated with the congregation and the priest all facing the same direction in worship to God. Mm-hmm. The priest, who in persona Christi offers the sacrifice at the altar. The less scripture was read, and like we said last week, a homily wasn't required except on a solemnity. So these were sort of the things that happened during the liturgy. So people would listen to a homily, right? But for the most part, everything was done
in Latin,
sotto voce. Is what they say, in a low voice is what they say. So you can't hear what's said, right? Yeah. That's why the bells, when you hear bing, bing, bing,
then you know what's going on.
You know that the consecration has taken place. The host, the bread has changed into the body of Jesus. And so that's sort of what the Eucharist, what celebration of the Mass looked like. Now we're more familiar with our celebration of the Eucharist, so we don't have to explain that, I guess. But there are significant changes that have happened. You know, we talked last week about chant. Mm-hmm. You know, and now it's, you know, all I'm saying, I guess, is what I'm trying to say is you can understand some people's disappointment with the change.
100%. And the interpretation of the change, right?
Yes.
And the way you would take it.
Change in general is hard for people.
Yes.
Now, I am a big fan, personally, of always reminding myself that the Holy Mass is what it says it is, holy.
Yeah.
It's the sacrifice of the Mass. Jesus is present on our altar. The Word is proclaimed. Jesus is present in the Word. He's present in the priest. He's present in the Eucharist. He's present in the people. It's a holy celebration that should be different from everything else outside of the church building.
Agreed.
Right? Like, we shouldn't just come to church like we're at the movie theater.
That's right.
We shouldn't come to church like we're at a bingo hall or you know, there's something sacred about our buildings. There's something sacred about what we're doing at the Mass together. So, so that being said, that still happens,
Yeah.
you know, in our celebration of the Mass today. What I'm not surprised is that people thought that the sacredness of the Mass was being butchered, if you will, right? Because all of a sudden, they've moved furniture around the altar. They went from singing chants, or to chanting, I guess, to playing sort of the banjo to be more dramatic. You know, and all these different sorts of things. I mean, you hear stories of liturgical dancing and
even the clown mass. That's a real thing.
Like, is that a real thing?
Yeah, it's a real thing.
Oh,
They've actually got,
and you do hear these stories. Like there was real fallout of Vatican II.
Yes.
And for the reason we said kind of last episode, that because the way that these documents are composed, it's in the form of general norms. They don't give direct prescriptions. They don't say, okay, you're not allowed to use Latin anymore. We want all of the beautiful altars torn down and put like this weird 1970s
altar.
Altar, just like modern architecture, kind of those kinds of things. Clown masses. You have these kind of extreme examples of people, and again, like you said, probably with a bit of an ideological agenda to try and push the envelope, try and, you know, have this kind of avant-garde approach to liturgy and church. And push things too far. And really, there were kind of, I would say, clear misinterpretations of the spirit of the council. But I would also say that those are extreme examples, and those aren't representative of what the new order of the Mass.
Yes.
I think one of the ones that gets me the most, actually. So when I'm doing a lot of research, I heard a lot from both sides. I went both on, let's say, a left side, a more progressive side, and the ideas that they were trying to push forward. Everything from women priests to Masses as more entertainment. And I think that's what the difference that you were talking about before was. Mass is not entertainment. Mm-hmm. Mass is a spiritual exercise. It is a spiritual gift to us for food. It's spiritual food for us. And so if we approach Mass as spiritual food, as being a spiritual feast, if you will, it's not about entertainment. When you go to a feast, it's not about being entertained. It's about eating. It's about being nourished. And so if you approach Mass that way, about being nourished, then the changes of Vatican II make sense. You're getting everything in the language that you understand. You are being able to see the consecration happen in front of you. You're being able to see the priest whisper, bless, wash his hands, all those things that aren't behind the veil anymore. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. You're being able to participate in the Mass in a fuller way. But if you look, the wording allowed it to become less about the sacrament of the Mass and more about how to include people in the Mass. And people interpret that as entertainment. Let's entertain. And that's where you get, like, again, that's an extreme example of, I've heard of puppet masses too, but like that's a whole other thing. I have pictures of it. I have pictures, but those are like, they don't happen all the time.
I've never heard of
I'm going to show pictures next time, okay?
Wait. I can't
But those are far extreme examples. But again, they became more about liturgical dancing, about entertaining, less about spiritual nourishment.
Yeah, it's important to remember that we're at Mass to worship.
Yeah.
And to worship who? Not ourselves.
Exactly.
It's to worship God.
And even the music.
And everything should point us towards worshiping, from the scriptures to the homily to the music selected to what actually happens during the Mass. You know, yes, there's a time and place for presentations and all these different things, and it's not during
the Mass.
The Mass. You know?
I think it's a really important distinction to make, that if you read the Vatican II documents, specifically the first one, with that in mind, you're going to agree with what the Vatican says. You know what I mean? Everything that the Vatican says, and you take it with that light. You don't try to take it looking for loopholes, right? Because if we talk about essay style, you can find loopholes. Oh, let's take this word and rearrange it to mean more this than this. And then we got 5 or 6 different paragraphs that we can change to forming a different view, right?
So that's an end. So I think we should just mention that the Mass, because there is Mass still celebrated today in Latin, like they celebrated prior to the changes that came forth from Vatican II. And our Mass, I shouldn't say our Mass, I guess, but there's the ordinary form that we celebrate and the extraordinary form that is celebrated in Latin. The extraordinary form, I've not had much experience attending an extraordinary form Mass, but it is beautiful. Oh, it's beautiful.
I love it.
The ordinary form can be beautiful as well.
100%.
You know, and I think there are opinions on both sides of. People who attend exclusively the extraordinary form will say what gong show, for lack of better words, the ordinary form is. What's a better word there? Try and heighten my vocabulary today, Matt.
What a clown show.
No, I'm kidding. They say, that's so horrible to attend an ordinary form Mass.
But on the flip side.
And then on the other side, there's people who attend exclusively the ordinary form Mass who say, what are those people doing still going to Mass in Latin? They're crazy.
Flipped around. They're not even going to face the people.
So I think there has to be charity on both sides. We're celebrating the Eucharist together. We're present during the sacrifice, and I'm just happy that people are at Mass. Yeah. Whether you're at the extraordinary form Mass or the ordinary form Mass, they're both. There's beauty in both of them, and I think we have to be charitable with one another.
I think the people that have complaints. So we talked about like the left, who kind of take the wording, skew it a little bit to their own purpose. At the same time, you have what would be considered more the extreme right, I would say, that take it Vatican II but don't take the wording of Vatican II, more take what they see as a result of Vatican II and complain about it from there. And so then they see things, and there is one thing that comes to mind that I do agree with, not that I agree with, but I see as a result, and this is one of the, like, there's a lot of different things, but it's talking about extraordinary Eucharistic ministers. When you took, this is my one thing that makes sense to me, but then try to find it in the Vatican II documents. I couldn't find it yet, but that doesn't mean that I won't. But talking about taking it at one time, before Vatican II, the priest's hands were holy hands that transubstantiation, consecration, God used his hands, right, to bless and to do all that things. And they were a priest's hands were the only hands allowed to touch the Eucharist. So even the altar servers and stuff had the little pans and all that stuff to make sure that if the Eucharist fell. When we brought that into extraordinary
The order of form?
No, the extraordinary Eucharistic ministers.
Oh, extraordinary ministers of Holy Communion.
Yeah.
Yes, I see.
When we
you
brought
that
it down to that, we now took this beautiful, Jesus. We took Jesus and the awesomeness and the mystery, I guess, going to say, around the Eucharist, and now brought it into putting it in regular people's hands. I can see how that people stopped feeling like this is the true presence of God because, I can touch it, it's just bread. You know what I mean? Versus, so I understand where they have those arguments or that, but that's not because of, that's lack of teaching.
There's a real sympathy for people who want to maintain an attitude of reverence for that you want to say that we don't want to diminish the significance of the Eucharist being the actual person of Christ. Yeah. That we want everything from our liturgy, from the way we approach things, that we can't accept that just a layperson can hold Jesus in their hands. But I throw back to last week that this was the problem that a lot of people had with the Incarnation. That it's like that Jesus would humble himself to come among us. Some people could not accept. Some people would just like, no, God is above. God doesn't,
Good point.
exist in our mirth. He doesn't, this isn't his place. So, but all that, I don't want to say that that there's a certain point where that attitude could become complacent or irreverent. Yes. And I think that it's really important for us to draw these lines, that there are licit and illicit forms of liturgy, and that there are licit forms of liturgy in English, there are licit forms of liturgy in Latin. Yeah. There are licit forms in both. Yeah. And you mentioned SSPX earlier, that there are communities that have rejected Vatican II or other kind of teachings of the Church so thoroughly that they're consecrating hosts illicitly. They're so committed to their own kind of position. Their
own ideals.
Yeah, exactly. That there's a real kind of break that they've drawn the line. But it's important to draw the lines. But I think we need to know where to draw those as well.
It's funny because one of the things I heard, I was listening to somebody talk about Vatican II, and they were saying, like, if you really want to take Vatican II and understand the purpose behind it, go to Africa. Mm-hmm. And so talk about putting it in the language of the people and the practice of the people and allowing people to sing their praise and worship through their own side, not in Latin and stuff. The church in Africa is growing, is what it was talking about how the missionaries and just how alive the church in Africa is compared to the Western nations, you know what I mean? And that, so you could take Vatican II and make it come alive. Yeah. And it did. And it didn't lose any of its importance or mystery or anything. Or, depending on what happens, you could take it and, again, change it one way or the other, and it hurts the church, So.
Sorry, just and again, talking about the difficulties people have with some of the documents, like the conversations I find myself in, it's mostly Sacrosanctum, Concilium, and Lumen Gentium that people take the most issue with, and it's a lot of it has to do with enculturation, bringing parts of culture into the Mass. Yeah. But we talked last week about maybe prior to some of the Vatican II documents, people being alienated from. So that Sacrosanctum Concilium specifically, so that you don't just bring every aspect of culture into the Mass. It's not just a free-for-all. It's just that the extent to which you allow, the culture of the people, the world outside, into the Mass is aiding them in their understanding of the sacraments. Yeah. And even when we're talking about Gregorian chant and Latin liturgy, those are enculturated practices within the history of the Church. It wasn't though it was Latin from day one, and then Vatican II changed it. That likely the Last Supper, I think most biblical scholars would say, Aramaic. But even in the early centuries, it was mostly spoken in Greece and in Greek, and then even in the Roman Church, I believe,
and then
until even Constantine. But then there was kind of an adoption period as well. So Latin being the official language of the Church, that's something that developed over time and was brought in from the outside culture, was brought in from the Roman Empire. Yeah. Chant itself was closer to the first millennium. Yeah. And these are beautiful aspects of the living tradition of the Church. But to say that they're kind of static elements that can't change doesn't agree with the history on I guess either end of the Church.
Okay, we're almost out of time, but I want to mention two more things. Okay. Maybe just one, because we're almost out of time. But there are people who think that because of the changes at Vatican II is why you've seen a decline in the practice of faith, in the understanding of faith, in the reverence shown towards the sacrament, in participation in the life of the Church. What would we say to that? Is there any truth to that? I mean,
I think it's actually it's part of the change, and the part of the change that was the problem was exactly the reason Vatican II had to happen, was that people didn't understand what was going on, didn't have quite a fuller understanding of what's going on, and then to explain it, we didn't do a great job from the 60s to now. I mean, it's taken us 50 years, 60 years to start to still change how it's taught, how it's believed. Like, if you go into a church and just say, okay, this person right here, they're the be-all, end-all, they're going to consecrate the Eucharist, like it's a mystery, and taking that away. But now that we can hold it, now that we can actually understand, wrap our minds around it, people like to give answers sometimes that don't have answers. People like to, and so because of that, it deteriorates from the awesomeness and the holiness of the Eucharist or the Church and the sacraments. If you actually go into, if you're solely seeking truth and you go into what the Church teaches, it's amazing. And like if we all believed as holy as we should or as we could the true presence of the Eucharist, how much different would Mass be? How much fuller would Mass be? How much, like, you wouldn't let your kids would be at Mass because this is a miracle happening in front. Like, you know what I mean? There would be a longing or something different in our hearts, I think, if the whole congregation of the Church felt the same way. I think the majority, or not even a majority because I know the statistics, but a big part of the Church that go on Sunday do feel that. But we've grown through this period of 50 or 60 years where it's slowly the Church has readjusted its understanding to people like, no, I'm going to choose what I believe now because I can read it up. And they're either just too lazy or just don't do it.
Yeah, and we spoke really quickly last week about just kind of the historical situation that the council was a part of, that these, like the trajectories of kind of modernism and atheism, and these forces were already kind of at work in culture. And again, like people would say that, because the council happened and then these declines happened, the council was maybe the cause for that. That it's you have these declines, or you have these, and we're actually on an upturn, but in Protestant denominations, in other kind of faith communities that didn't have the Second Vatican Council, so it's hard to attribute those declines to the council itself. But I think in terms of actually doing kind of factor analysis on why this is happening, Archbishop Charles Chaput has I believe he spent his summers as a kid in Quebec, and so he witnessed kind of the decline in like the popularity of Catholicism in Quebec, just from kind of a demographic point of view, that when he was a kid in the 60s, 70s, that everybody went to mass. Everybody, Catholicism was a huge part of the culture. Everyone was catechized. Everyone had kind of the expected structure that supported a Catholic life. But because of the forces, the cultural forces at work, that led to a steady decline. And his experience, becoming a priest, becoming a bishop, becoming his recognition of the symptom that's causing that's the cause of this decline, is that even though they were properly catechized, they weren't properly evangelized.
Yes.
That it's so we need to have both. We need to have an understanding of the church, of what the church teaches. We need to be able to have discussions about the licitude of different liturgical forms, but that's not enough. Mm-hmm. We need to encounter Christ in the sacraments. And we need to understand what all of our discussions about liturgy and about the church in general are about.
I think sometimes we're so preoccupied with all that other stuff that you were mentioning that we fail to encounter Jesus, and that's really what is going to enlighten our life and bring us to salvation.
It's cool you say that, only because one of the stats that prove it is the seminary. The enrollment in the seminary before Vatican II had actually dropped out already, and that was part of the reason actually that the Pope was looking at those stats. I mean, this is story and legend, but looking at some of those stats, and for 5 years before that, it had dropped significantly, and that was why we need to bring this into it to re-evangelize or reintroduce the love of Jesus into people's hearts.
Yeah, and we have to remember too that there are some people that look at the church with sort of rose-colored glasses prior to Vatican II, right? I mean, it wasn't a perfect church or a perfect world then. It's not a perfect church or a perfect world today, right? There's some challenges that come with the history.
100%.
Some people argue that if we only went back, things would be better.
If we put our own personal revelation or how we're supposed to interpret God's plan for the church, if I say this is how the Catholic Church of the whole entire world should do it, over top of an ecumenical council with 2,800 bishops who were praying for 4 years about the direction of the church. If I'm doing that, then I am no better than some other people that might have just decided to walk away from the church on their own. It's an ecumenical council. It's like what we talked about before last week. It was one of the highest forms of decision making in our church, and it's not taken lightly. And most, if not the majority, 98% or something of the people involved in this council, or I think it was 99% on all documents, voted in favor of every single document that came out of there. And I'm going to put my own determination, my own private revelation that God has said that this is, you know what I mean? How much do I got to think of myself to do that? You know what I mean? No, I trust in Mother Church. I trust in the fact that God is in control, the Holy Spirit's in control of these people and that made these decisions. And I'm going to trust. I might not understand it. I may not understand the wisdom or the knowledge behind it, but I'm not going to pretend that I am better than that. You know what I mean? I'm going to, okay, God, I trust that you're doing. And if not, then we take St. Francis's route, which, pray, do things in poverty and humility, and then let God use you to change the church, but through your humility, not through your turn or burn action.
Turn or burn action. Yeah, and I think at the end of the day, the mission of Vatican II was, to bring us closer to Jesus, right? For the church to enter into the.
Yeah, I just really quickly, but with all that said, that there have been real steps made,
yes.
and efforts made to reconcile, traditionally minded Catholics who see the beauty of older forms to kind of the newer order. That I'm thinking specifically of something like Pope Benedict's Spirit of the Liturgy.
Yeah.
There are communities who are taking music seriously, that are taking liturgy seriously, that are using mass parts in Latin and in the vernacular interchangeably, so people know what they're saying when they're speaking Latin. So that there is beauty in the mass, and there are communities, and even here we've tried to incorporate that, and it's really great to see people taking liturgy seriously, whether they're traditional or newer. I consider myself a newer Catholic because I haven't been Catholic for
Okay, well, we've
Yeah.
gone way over time,
Yeah.
but I'm going to mention one thing that you can't comment on, or
no,
else we're going
no,
to talk for another few minutes. But what a shame for me after Vatican II, like things I look back on, are beautiful churches in Canada that were just whitewashed. They painted over all the murals.
Was that because?
And they took down, well, it was part of the liturgical restructuring and the moving the furniture around the sanctuary and trying to be modern. But it's a shame to think that some churches behind that white plaster have beautiful icons or depictions of the apostles or the saints or whatever, right? But nonetheless, maybe lesson learned.
I love walking into a church with the old altar, like the high altar at the back, like just looking at that all throughout Mass sometimes.
It's beautiful to see,
really
yeah.
is.
Okay, we did 2 parts on Vatican II, and probably lots of fallout from this conversation will continue to occur. So thanks for having this conversation. If you want to send a question or a comment to us, send it to the Catholic Buzz Podcast at gmail.com, and we will continue to answer your questions and discuss all the different things that come our way when we're talking about the Catholic faith. My name is Father Daniele, and for Josh Sullivan, Matt Van Milligan, thank you for watching today or listening wherever you are watching or listening, and we'll see you next time on the Catholic Buzz.